Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel STRIKEPOINTMEDIA. Today we're diving deep into one of the most pivotal and complex phases of the ongoing war in Ukraine, the offensive by Ukrainian forces aimed at isolating Crimea. This is a multifaceted operation involving strategy, geography, logistics, industrial capacity, and international dynamics. I'll break it down for you across different dimensions: exterior, the broad context and terrain; interior, what's happening inside the region, among forces and in logistics; performance, how the operation is going; safety features, risks, counter measures, humanitarian issues, unique selling points, why this matters and what sets it apart; price in terms of costs, casualties, resources, and long-term impacts. And finally, we'll wrap up with a conclusion drawing all these strands together. When we look at the exterior, the big picture setting, we must first recognize that the peninsula of Crimea has been under Russian control since the annexation in 2014, following the political upheaval in Kiev. Russia rapidly militarized the area, using Crimea as a strategic launch point for operations in southern Ukraine and as a hub for naval and air forces in the Black Sea region. Geographically, Crimea's connection to the Russian mainland via the Kerch Strait and the Kerch Bridge, constructed by Russia to link the peninsula to Russia proper, has become a vital logistical lifeline. Cutting or degrading those supply routes is central to Ukraine's plan to isolate Crimea. On the exterior terrain side, the Dnieper River, the southern coastlines of Ukraine, and the left bank operations form the backdrop for the movement of equipment, troops, and supplies. This large operational theater means that Ukraine is not simply engaging in a frontal assault, but is striving to sever the supply chains, choke off access, and force a change in the Russian strategic calculus. In short, the exterior dimension frames the war in terms of terrain, national borders, logistics lines, and strategic geography. Now let's move into the interior. This is where the action, the decision-making, the lifeblood of the offensive resides. Inside this campaign, we can see several overlapping activities. Ukrainian forces are increasingly targeting the logistical arteries of Russian forces operating in and from Crimea. For example, routing attacks on ferries across the Kerch Strait, rail and road links, and infrastructure that support the Russian naval base and air assets in Crimea. For the Ukrainian side, this means assembling intelligence, launching precision strikes, sometimes long-range, using unconventional methods, special forces, underwater explosives, drones, and coordinating with Western-supplied weaponry. For the Russian side, the interior involves trying to defend these supply lines, reinforce positions on Crimea, maintain morale, and keep the flow of men, material, and ammunition going under more difficult circumstances. Inside Crimea and its peripheral zones, there is an interplay between occupation administration by Russia, local infrastructure, ports, railways, bases, and frontline dynamics, bombardment, missile strikes, sabotage. For instance, reports show that Ukraine has struck against Russian military hangars, Black Sea Fleet headquarters, and other high-value targets deep inside Crimea, signaling that the peninsula is no longer a safe rear area for Russia. The interior also includes the human dimension. Local populations, the Crimean Tatars, occupied Ukrainian communities, the presence of Russian troops, civilians under threat of missile strikes or shelling. The operational tempo inside is rising. The Ukrainian campaign is gradually shifting from defensive to more daring offensive logistics, interdiction operations. On the Ukrainian side, the interior challenge has been synchronizing multiple front, south, east, and behind enemy lines, while ensuring that they have enough ammunition, long-range weapons like cruise missiles, drones, and intelligence to strike in Crimea. On the Russian side, the interior challenge is maintaining the supply lines, defending the peninsula from strikes, and dealing with increasingly contested logistics. As one analysis notes, Ukraine is slowly but steadily weakening Russia's grip on Crimea. By going after those critical supply routes, that phrase captures the interior dynamic, weakening the grip, not necessarily full breakout yet, but attrition, denial of freedom of movement, and imposing an unsustainable logistics burden. The complexity inside the interior war means there are many nodes: the rail junctions, the Kerch Bridge, the Black Sea Fleet bases, Russian airfields, Ukrainian missile and drone bases, local resistance, irregular forces, electronic warfare, intelligence covert ops. All of this adds up to a highly contested interior battlefield that is less about sweeping blitzes and more about logistics, attrition, choke points, and strategy of indirect pressure. Moving on to performance, how is the operation going in terms of meeting its objectives, timelines, and results so far? The Ukrainian strategy of isolating Crimea is gradually showing measurable effects. Analysts note that Ukraine has successfully executed strikes on ferries used to move supplies across the Kerch Strait and other logistical nodes. These attacks are not yet liberating Crimea outright, but they are increasing the cost and risk for Russia in maintaining the occupation and supply chain. The performance metric here is not just land gained, but pressure applied, supply routes disrupted, morale impacted, and strategic options limited. What's notable is that Russia has to devote more resources to defend what was assumed to be secure rear areas. Bases inside Crimea that were once considered safe are now threatened. This means Ukraine is generating strategic surprise, shifting from survival to initiative. Performance likewise is measured in how Ukraine adapts its weapons, its targeting, its logistics to reach into Crimea. For example, cruise missiles provided by Western allies have extended Ukraine's reach inside the peninsula's rear zones. The interior operations link with performance is strong. Better intelligence, improved weapons, precision strikes. These improve performance. On the flip side, Russia still retains major advantages inside Crimea: fortified bases, naval superiority in the Black Sea, control of much of the infrastructure, and large quantities of equipment and manpower. So performance is mixed. Ukraine is advancing not by great leaps, but by grinding down Russian capability and positioning for perhaps a larger phase when the time is right. The very fact that Russia is reacting, reallocating resources, and modifying its logistics indicates that Ukraine is having an effect. So overall, performance is promising for Ukraine's campaign, albeit still a long haul. Now, when we speak of safety features, this isn't about a consumer product, but about risk mitigation and protective measures in a military campaign, both for the forces involved and for civilian populations. The safety of logistics lines, the protection of supply convoys, air defense for rear bases, early warning systems, electronic counter measures, and civil defense protocols for civilians in Crimea and adjacent territories all come into play. For Ukraine's side, one safety feature is the careful planning of operations to disrupt logistics without overly exposing their own forces to major counter-attacks. The interior operations use long-range missiles and drones to minimize risk of Ukrainian casualties behind Russian lines. For Russia's side, the safety features include hardened infrastructure in Crimea, coastal defenses, layered air defense systems, and fortifications to protect supply hubs and the peninsula's environs. However, the risk remains high. Missile strikes in Crimea have hit civilian areas, fuel depots, bases previously thought safe. For instance, Ukrainian strikes on oil terminals in Crimea targeted fuel supply for Russian forces. That introduces significant safety hazard for local infrastructure and civilians. The military safety dimension also includes the possibility of escalation, increased civilian casualties, and humanitarian risk. A campaign targeting supply routes in occupied territory has inherent risk for non-combatants. For the Ukrainian side, part of their internal planning must include avoiding collateral damage, maintaining legitimacy in the eyes of Western support, and planning for what happens if Russia retaliates heavily. For the Russian side, the safety dimension includes managing morale, preventing internecine logistic failure, ensuring that supply lines to Crimea aren't severed catastrophically. Thus, safety features in this context are more like risk management features of the campaign. Now let's talk about unique selling points. In other words, what makes this Ukrainian offensive to isolate Crimea distinctive, crucial, and likely to matter long-term. First, geography. Targeting Crimea shifts the war from the East Donbas to the south, which has been less intensively covered, and it hits a symbolically powerful territory for Russia. The peninsula is more than just land. It is a symbol of Russian prestige, named by Vladimir Putin as a sacred place, and treated as a showpiece of Russian military power. By going after Crimea's logistics, Ukraine is not only hitting material targets, but attacking the narrative of Russian invulnerability. Second, the campaign uses indirect methods, long-range missiles, drones, naval interdiction, covert operations, which means that even though large-scale ground advances in Crimea may be unrealistic for now, Ukraine's ability to impose attrition and to hamper Russia's operations there is unique and potentially game-changing. Third, cutting off Crimea's supply routes and isolating it would force Russia to either commit massive resources to maintain the status quo or reconsider the cost-benefit of holding the peninsula. That strategic pressure is itself a unique selling point for this phase of the war. Fourth, the campaign attracts Western interest and aid. The need for long-range precision weapons, intelligence sharing, and Western willingness to supply them means that this campaign is a litmus test for the Western-Ukrainian partnership. Finally, from a broader strategic narrative, if Ukraine is successful in isolating Crimea, it will serve as a huge morale boost and geopolitical turning point in the conflict, altering the balance in the Black Sea, the Southern Theater, and possibly influence negotiation dynamics. Next, the price. This means the cost: human, material, economic, strategic, and future cost. On the human side, Ukrainian casualties will rise as they press forward, and Russian casualties will also increase as the fighting transitions into intensifying strikes behind the lines. On the material side, long-range missiles, drones, special forces operations, intelligence assets, all cost money, logistics, training, and maintenance. On the strategic side, Russia devoting more resources to Crimea means less available for other fronts, which is a cost for them, but also a cost in terms of concentration of forces. For Ukraine, diverting some resources to the Crimea campaign might slow other frontline efforts, thus representing an opportunity cost. Economically, Crimea's infrastructure, if disrupted or damaged, leaves large reconstruction costs both for Russia to maintain and eventually potentially for Ukraine to rehabilitate if it returns. There is also the cost of escalation. Russia might respond with heavier strikes on Ukrainian territory, civilian infrastructure, and that risk is built into the price. Additionally, if the campaign drags on without decisive result, the morale cost on Ukrainian troops and civilians can be non-negligible. The price is steep, but the payoff could equally be enormous in strategic terms. Finally, the conclusion. This offensive to isolate Crimea reflects a critical evolution in the war. Where earlier much of the focus was on eastern Ukraine and the Donbas region, we now see a campaign that targets the supply chain and rear area logistics of occupying forces, forcing Russia to defend territory once considered secure. The geography of Crimea, its symbolic importance, its logistical value to Russia, all make it the right target for Ukraine in this phase. The interior operations show that Ukraine is not simply waiting, but proactively imposing attritional pressure. The performance to date is promising. Ukraine is successfully disrupting supply lines, posing new threats inside Crimea and forcing Russia to respond. The safety dimension shows that the battlefield is shifting. Civilians and rear areas are becoming more contested, which raises risk. The unique selling points of this campaign lie in its strategic audacity and long term potential to shift the balance in the southern theater. The price is high in lives, materials, economic cost, the possibility of escalation, but the reward if successful would be significant. Weakening Russia's hold on a strategic bastion, opening possibilities for Ukrainian advances, altering the Black Sea balance, and influencing negotiations. So, as STRIKEPOINT Media, we will continue to watch this campaign closely. The battle to isolate Crimea tells us a lot about modern warfare. Logistics matter, precision strikes matter, the rear isn't safe, and symbolism can change real strategic outcomes. If Ukraine succeeds, it could mark a turning point. If it fails or stalls, the costs may mount and the war may prolong further. Either way, this offensive is a major chapter in the war that demands our attention. Thanks for watching, and if you found this explanation helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Let's delve deeper into the maps, footage, and analysis next time. Until then, stay informed, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next video.